What's up, amazing people? Welcome back to the Ryan Files. And if you're new here, you've just stumbled into a conversation that's about to flip your perspective on Hollywood, storytelling, and the power of imagination. A few weeks ago, we had the legendary Brian Godawa on the show, diving deep into his Watcher series and his latest book, Judah Maccabee, Parts 1 and 2, Abomination of Desolation, which, by the way, is out now on Amazon in hardcover, paperback, Kindle, and Audible audiobook. And guess what? He's back. But this time we're peeling back the curtain on something different. How storytelling shapes culture, how Hollywood controls narratives, and why art should never, ever be a sermon. We're talking about what makes stories actually work, whether it's biblical epics, dark comedies, or that one movie that should never have been made again, but Hollywood keeps on trying. Before we dive in, do me a solid. Hit that subscribe button if you love mind-expanding conversations like this. Seriously, it's free. And it helps us bring on guests like Brian who deliver the kind of insight you won't find anywhere else. All right? So let's get to it.
Chronicles of the Watchers is a series of biblical novels by best-selling author Brian Godawa, charting the influence of spiritual warfare on human history, a war of gods and men. Jezebel, harlot queen of Israel, Moses against the gods of Egypt, and other supernatural historical novels in the series Chronicles of the Watchers. Available in ebook, paperback, and audiobook at Amazon.com. That's Chronicles of the Watchers by Brian Godawa at Amazon.com.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Ryan Files. This week they're bringing back the one and only Brian Godawa. And we last time we talked about some of the books you've been writing, Judah Maccabees and all the different things about the Watchers, Nephilim, and so on. But bringing you back to this week to talk a little bit more about the actual process of being creative and writing these books that are taking fiction and the Bible, bringing them together. And then also movies and Hollywood and how it's all connected, and just your outlook as, you know, an award-winning screenwriter and someone who best-selling author, so someone who's neck deep rather into the world of creativity. Appreciate you coming back on, man. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Ryan.
So let's get into it. You're a best-selling author, which I'm so enamored by that. And then screenwriters, I love what you're doing. You talked about last episode. You talked about how your idea about Noah was a screenplay that you had to turn into a book. And that's kind of how this whole thing started. But as someone who has been out there in Hollywood as a writer, successful writer, best-selling author, tell me a little bit about the process of, you know, taking something from the Bible, making it into fiction that is consumable, entertaining to people. And yet I'm sure you have to walk that line of not offending Christians too, who, you know, are afraid of getting their eschatology from fiction. So yeah, talk about it a little bit.
Wow. Well, that's a big, wide topic, but you know, and I suppose I'll have to speak mostly from the dramatic fiction angle rather than movies, because even though I have written some scripts of movies for Bible stories, they haven't been made, so I can't speak to that so much, but there are issues that are cover both sides. And so first of all, as a Christian, you know, one of the reasons why I went to Hollywood was I never wanted to make Christian movies, because I call it the Christian ghetto, you know, where it's sort of like Christian movies and Christian music and Christian books and Christian this and Christian that. You know, I always felt like, you know what, I want to be in the world, not of it. I want to tell my stories and point people to God. And, you know, I didn't feel I would be able to do that so much or so well if I'm just, you know, writing stories for other Christians type of thing. And so one of the reasons why I want to make Hollywood movies was because I loved movies so much. They impacted me so greatly. And I remember even when I was a young person that I would, you know, weep at movies because they were so meaningful and emotional. But then I would also notice when I started growing my Christian faith around my college years, I read Francis Schaeffer, who was a Christian philosopher back in the 70s. And he helped me to understand the worldview that was being communicated through the arts, and specifically also through movies, because I was an artist, a visual artist back then, but I loved movies, and I kind of wanted to kind of wanted to make movies, And but reading him helped me recognize that there is a worldview behind these stories. And then I started recognizing that the worldviews coming out of Hollywood, humanism, existentialism, these kinds of things, they weren't very godly, to say the least. Now, it doesn't mean that they're all false, because there's a lot of good truth. If anyone tries to tell a story and to be as honest about human nature and about who we are, there's going to be a lot of things that ring true to you. But then all of our stories are guided by our worldviews. That is, where do we think meaning and purpose comes from? And what is it all going towards? Is it nothing, or is it something, or is it fate, or is it God? Whatever. All these things drive storytellers to conclude their stories in the direction of what they believe in, whether they are consciously doing it or not. And so recognizing that, I was like, I remember in college just watching movies and seeing a humanistic story and just saying, I would weep, because I would want to see God's truth being up on the silver screen. I want God's truth up there, And again, it's not like it wasn't happening, because sure, there was a lot of old movies like, the Ten Commandments or something like that. If you looked in the past, there were plenty of movies that would have biblical worldviews to them. And even in the 70s, there were. In fact, by the 1980, 81, I think it was, I can't remember. The movie that really inspired me to start to study storytelling specifically, I was just a visual artist, was Chariots of Fire. And there was a secular movie made in Hollywood that won the Oscar. And yet it was about a Christian, and it was made by non-Christians, which blew my mind.
Right.
And it was a good story about Eric Liddell, who was a runner in the Olympics, and it was all about his honoring God with his life and with his running. And it just blew my mind, and it told me, yes, it can be done. And that was my inspiration, where I began to study storytelling and study it in a way that it would enable me to communicate a worldview without being preachy, without being forceful, which is what I felt a lot of the Christian art in those days had become, Christian movies and stuff. And even to this day, I think a lot of it suffers from this idea of preachiness. And where does that come from, right? Because look, there are preachy movies as well in Hollywood. They're preaching leftism or globalism or environmentalism, all that kind of stuff. So there's preachiness on all parts. But the pursuit of a good artist is to seek to embody a true, meaningful story, incarnate their message within the story in such a way that it's organic to the story and it's not forced on it. It's not like a sermon that's preached to you. And the problem that I found with most Christians was that when they approach this storytelling, they want to glorify God so much, and I get that because so do I, but they want to glorify God so much that they prioritize the message over the medium, or the meaning over the craft. And what I mean by that is they will, because you prioritize the message, you're going to make choices when you're faced with them, as you have to, like say you're making a movie and you've got budget constraints. You're going to make your choices based on making the message more important than the medium, than the craft. In other words, and that's, by the way, that's not all bad, right? I'm not saying that's inherently bad, but what I'm saying is, what that ends up doing is it lowers the quality of the production values, because they're not as important to you as the message. It also results in the preachiness, because you're so concerned about making sure the message is clearly understood that you do not understand how the nature of art really works. And it works in a non-direct way. It can work in a direct way. Don't get me wrong. There can be some direct points that are fine. But where's that difference between a direct, strong message versus a preachiness? Well, it comes in understanding that your story should embody your meaning and your message, not tacked on like, you shouldn't have to have a scene in every Christian movie where a pastor is in a church sharing the gospel with someone. That shouldn't be the case. And I think the weakness of Christian storytelling comes is exemplified for me in an incident that I heard about or read about where Mel Gibson was making, the Passion of the Christ,
Yeah.
and he was bringing it to many churches and Christian thought leaders and Jewish as well, because he wanted their input, because he knew that this was something that would affect people, and he didn't want it to be offensive if it didn't need to be, that kind of a thing, or he wanted it to appeal to as many as possible. But of course, he's a man of conviction, so it's not like he's not a sellout, but he wants to have input, right? Yeah. Well, I knew some guys who were working with the marketing on that, and they basically said, look, he would show this movie where you basically see the gospel incarnate in Jesus Christ suffering for our sins like you've never seen before. That doctrine of Christ being a substitute, suffering, taking our sins upon him and suffering in our place, that there's no better movie that has depicted that than The Passion of the Christ. And then afterwards, many Protestant pastors and leaders would say, that's really good, but maybe can you put John 3:16 on the screen at the end of the movie so that people will get it and will believe in Jesus? And it completely shows the inability of many of these evangelicals and Protestants to understand that the incarnation of the Christ story is the gospel. They feel that you have to preach these words for it to make sense. And that shows the difference too between the Roman Catholic, Gibson is a Catholic, and so they're very entrenched in imagery and such, and even they go too far in my opinion. But he understands the power of imagery and the power of storytelling to incarnate the gospel. And so, as a matter of fact, he did have the Bible verse, I think, in the beginning from Isaiah, where it talks about he suffered for our sins or something like that. But that just shows you the problem with many Christians, where they feel like art has to be a sermon. It has to be clear, and it has to, as clear as a sermon, and it has to make these points, and it has to be understood very, very, clearly. And so they're very concerned about that. And again, I understand why they feel that way, but that's why they end up being preachy, where they feel like you have to, if you don't say it with words, they're not going to get it, And so, by the way, that was something that, I've, had to deal with all my life as a storyteller. Am I saying too much? Am I, it's a perennial issue for all storytellers. How can I say what I want to say without saying it so explicitly that it feels like they're being preached to?
Yeah. You know what, though? That's
not easy. It's not simple.
It's not. And I was involved in a project, won't name it or anything. People know what it is if they're watching, but, as an actor, you don't really have any, say on the story. Your job is to deliver what the story is. And, there's directors and producers and writers and all that involved in this process, but you're just bringing a character to life. But, this particular movie is a Christian movie, faith-based film, if you will. And, it did get a little preachy on some things. And it's so funny. People would come up to me even today, years later, over a decade later, and just talk about like, I like the movie, but this thing it just seemed out of place. And it was. Yeah. It was, because that was, like you said, it was the point that was trying to be made.
They didn't trust the art to do, or their story to do the job. They felt they had to preach a sermon, and art is not a sermon. Yeah. In fact, if I think it even goes so far as like the parables of Jesus, the parable of the Good Samaritan or something, there's a reason why Jesus told stories rather than sermons. Yeah, he did give a Sermon on the Mount. Sure, he did. But his most of his teaching was through stories and examples and parables and such. And I think the reason why is, I would explain it this way. It's like if you try to analyze a frog, you did this in high school biology, at least in my day. They probably don't do it anymore. You want to figure out, what is a frog like? What does it mean? What it's about? You kill it, you dissect it on the table, and you open it up, right? Well, that's kind of what, to me, thinking that art is supposed to be a sermon is like you end up trying to dissect it and figure out what the real meaning is. And in so doing, you kill the frog or you kill the story. So, as a matter of fact, the best way to describe who is my neighbor is not literally defining something with logical, rational terms. It's telling the story. And in fact, I would say that, it's even better to just retell the Good Samaritan rather than explaining what the meaning of the parable was. In other words, the power of story is so much more than just rational intellect. Now, be aware, when I'm talking about this difference between rational intellect and sermons and such versus imagery and art, I'm not saying either or. I'm saying both and. We are creatures that we need both. We're creating God's image. We need reason and we need imagination, but we need them both. And to when you prioritize the message, you're going to get preachiness. But when you make them equal, the message and the medium equal, when I say medium, I mean the craft, the message and the craft. When you keep those equal, that's why I want to make the most entertaining, well-told story possible. Well, if you make those priorities equal, then what you're doing is you are honoring God because you are doing what the incarnation was, right? Jesus was both the Logos and the Imago Dei, or the image of God, right? And he was both equally God and man. Not one or the other. If you prioritize God over man, it's wrong. If you prioritize man over God, it's wrong. They're ultimately equal in Christ. And so in the same way, I think our stories and our art should be that way. You should as highly value the art or the craft as you do the message. That doesn't denigrate the message at all. It just makes them of equal importance, equal ultimacy, because when you imbalance those in either direction, you're going to have heresy. No, you're going to have preachiness, or you're going to have, meaninglessness or wastefulness. If you have only production values and you don't care about meaning, your story is not going to be as thrilling or as interesting to people, by the way. It will be empty, right? And so no matter how much special effects you have, if you don't have meaning to your story, it's going to be empty, right?
Right.
And so consequently, you have to have them both equal.
It's interesting. And I know that you're talking about this from a Christian perspective, but I think you see it in a number of other perspectives. There might be, just little button issues that people get, up in arms about, environmental stuff, global warming, whatever,
Well, yeah,
these
that's the
messages get preached.
Absolutely. And that's the problem with Hollywood right now, isn't it? Right. Yeah. I mean, the viewership is going down, like massively, because there's so much DEI. It's all about diversity, equity, inclusion. It's all about, forcing the left-wing values of what they think should be right, and preaching them. Like I've watched some movies that are feminist that I liked. It's if you tell a good story and you embody your message, I have no problem acknowledging that. Even though I disagree with feminism, they make some points worthy. But when you're preaching the feminism, then it's just not interesting, And the same thing goes with any of the left-wing values that they're trying to preach, whether it's equity, inclusion, or whatever. It's all the same.
Yep, it's very interesting. I've never really thought about it from this perspective. I knew this thing was going on, this thing was happening, but to hear someone like yourself explain it, and someone who you're explaining it, but you're also actively going through it, and which has made you a successful writer, I believe, in telling a story. The preachiness, taking preachiness out of books, out of Hollywood, that would be incredible.
Let me give you an example of my movie To End All Wars, with Kiefer Sutherland. It was way long time ago, 2021 or 2001, 2001. That was the movie that I got into Hollywood with. And, since then I did a few movies, and in these later years, I've been shifting more, writing more novels than movies. But but To End All Wars there was a great example because that was a true story about prisoners of war during World War II under the Japanese, Allied prisoners of war, and they were in Burma, and it was their story of suffering and how they dealt with it. And as a matter of fact, what happened was they decided they were losing hope, so they decided to try to regain hope by starting a little university, a university where they could like teach things to men and give them something to look forward to, education, that kind of thing. And so they scrounged around because even though they're prisoners of war, they would find a book here or a book there that somebody had kept. They ended up having Shakespeare. They had someone teaching Shakespeare, Plato, right? And then someone also had a Bible. And so they started teaching from the Bible. And it ended up transforming the camp and just in dramatic ways. It was really powerful. Some could look at that and say, oh, it's a Christian story. But the movie we made was a secular movie just with a Christian worldview. It was like Chariots of Fire for the new millennium, right? And it worked and it did it. But one of the interesting stories of that I think embodies what I'm trying to say here is, so you've got this, it actually did happen. They were teaching the Bible. So we show them teaching Shakespeare, we show them teaching Plato, and then we show them reading from the Bible with a little class around them, right? And, I'm trying to be realistic. So I'm just saying, oh, so he's reading from the text, and I picked a good text. Jesus said, who's my neighbor? How to love your neighbor, that kind of thing. Because he's reading from the Bible. And it wasn't a lot, but I just thought, oh, it was relevant there. But we found when you filmed it and showed it in context, the director ended up taking out the words Jesus said, and he just had him read the who's my neighbor part, the whole, I think it was the story of the Good Samaritan. I can't remember, but yeah, I think it was who's my neighbor. And I found that so interesting because that was more powerful by not saying Jesus. It was more powerful. Why? Because I think what happens is the audience feels like they're figuring it out for themselves. If you're preaching to them, you're telling them Jesus said, but if you just say the words and they go, that sounds familiar. Where is that? Oh, that's from Jesus. Then they are learning it themselves rather than being told. And so it ended up being just as powerful. My point being that we never said Jesus in there, but it was just as powerful because people figured out where it came from. They knew where it came from because they were reading a Bible. And so that's just one little example, but I think it typifies the difference between those who understand how to incarnate meaning into a story and those who feel they have to add preachy, teaching onto it.
Do you think in any way, shape, or form that need to, add the preachy moment or whatnot kind of justifies, it's an egotistical thing. Like, hey, I'm going to do this so that people know that I am a Christian, or I am going to put this in there so people
don't know. I can't speak to other people's, because there's obviously every writer has their own motives, but I can say though that the market for Christian movies, and having written for some Christian movies, they are driven by the people in power and the people who have money don't tend to know story as well. And they're the ones who think you have to say, you see what I'm saying? So the problem has always been the people with the power and money don't understand storytelling that well. And because they have the power, you try your best to convince them, but ultimately they say, no, this is what we want. This is what we want you to do. And I've come up against that a dozen times throughout my career where it's just like, this is the wrong thing to do. And it's like, no, we have the power, we have the money, we're making the movie, so you have to write this, And sadly, that's what happens, and that's the problem, And a lot of times it's the market too, where it's like, well, we got to have. They feel that the genre of Christian movies requires you have to have a scene in a church where a pastor figure is telling someone the gospel in some way. Yeah. That's something that you see a lot in Christian movies, and partly because they think you have to have it in there. Maybe the audiences tells them that. I don't know, but they're based on their own observation of what's going to make money, how they're going to sell their movies. They think things like you have to have that church scene in there, that kind of a thing. Sadly, it's misunderstanding of your audience. But sometimes it is the audience itself that comes to demand things that are not needed.
Test screenings are amazing. What comes out of those and the thoughts that people have for test screenings are
Yeah.
it is wild what offends certain people and what
Yeah.
other people see or think. Do you ever do you do that with your books? Do you have a test reading situation going on?
Well, I'll be honest, I did when I first started, but over the years, I don't so much anymore. I do have an editor, a professional editor that works with me. She's fantastic, and she challenges me, and she, with wisdom and intelligence, in terms of my storytelling, as well as the Christian market that she's familiar with, Christian audience. But I would say, having said that, I would say I do believe, though, over time, there's a symbiosis going on here with author and readers, and that is in order to write well in such a way that many people will love your stories, you have to be authentic. You have to write what you believe in, and you have to be willing to take the risk and say, well, if they don't like it, this is what I really love and I really believe in this. But at the same time, there's also a side where if you want more people to read your stuff, you do have to be aware of how the audience is reacting to your material. And it's a fine line between, oh well, they don't like this, they're going to be offended, so I'll just take it out, versus, you know, well, tough luck. This is they should like this, and if they don't, that's their problem. You know, I started out writing my novels, Bible novels. Quite frankly, they were more R-rated, and there's a lot of sex and violence in the Bible, and I was not afraid to deal with that. And coming from a Hollywood background, I wasn't, and I just thought, it's I don't try to exploit it. I try to it's very integrated into the story in such a way, in the way that the Bible does it, right? Like the point of sin is to show it's not desirable, but it's actually undesirable, and it leads to death and it leads to destruction and such. But if you don't accurately portray the evil, if you just make it look like 1970s villains, and where you don't really feel like they're in any real danger, like he's not going to murder or rape this girl, because you don't get the sense that he will do that, or you don't see or hear about any of that stuff, then you're not going to really believe the redemption of the story. The redemption won't have any power. The redemption of your story is only as powerful as the accuracy of how you're depicting the evil that you're being redeemed from, right?
Yeah.
But that has a line, and it's just like you're trying to show enough evil, like the Bible does, right? The Bible does show a lot of evil, but then sometimes it pulls back and it holds back. It doesn't tell everything, right? And so that's the balance that you're trying to get. Well, anyway, I came at it going, I'm going to be, I'm going to write for what I really like, and what I think is powerful and gritty. And I got to admit, over a few years, I got enough feedback from my readers that loved my stories, but they really thought that the sex and the violence stuff was too excessively described, explicit, And actually, quite frankly, over the years, I decided to pull back on the descriptions and become less explicit. I still have everything from adultery to mass rape to genocide in my stories, but I'm not as explicit in writing. And the reason why is not for moral reasons. It was a recognition that, look, I can deal with these things more indirectly and make the point, and therefore more people will be willing to read the stories. And I want more people to read my stories. I'm not going to compromise my meaning, and I'm not going to compromise what I really believe should be in there, but I'm going to listen to my audience and let it affect me. And it has affected me. And so now I write PG-13, but sometimes some people still find it offensive. But it wasn't for moral reasons, and it wasn't for just selling out reasons. It was a balance between the author and the reader. It's a symbiosis of interaction. I listen to them, and they listen to me, and it's actually been a wonderful journey for me in that sense.
So much of what you're talking about, Brian, it really comes down to communication,
Yeah.
and being an effective communicator. And I mean, you're at like this level, of what you're doing and writing these books. But I mean, just on an everyday level for everybody out there who's listening, who's never going to be the person to be a best-selling author, or a screenplay writer or whatever. I mean, I think you're really talking about communicating and understanding
Oh,
your audience and all that, and
absolutely.
how to be effective.
Yeah, but I also think if you understand storytelling, it is a way to enhance and enrich your life. So, for instance, I wrote a book called Hollywood Worldviews: Watching Films with Wisdom and Discernment. It's already like 20 years old, but it still is a good seller, and they use it in Christian colleges and stuff around the country. And the reason why is because what I did was I tried to I was studying storytelling in Hollywood, and I realized how much of storytelling reflects worldview and how it reflects Christianity itself, particularly Western storytelling. How very much the notion of the hero's journey and the redemption of the hero, it reflects very much something that is in line with Christianity. And so I wanted to put all that stuff down and sort of explain how storytelling works for movie viewers and TV viewers in a way that would help them appreciate watching movies and TV more, right?
Yeah.
And so I wrote the book Hollywood Worldviews, and it sort of explains how storytelling works for you. And it's that knowledge that gives you better appreciation, right? But it also is knowledge that gives you a more discerning ability. In other words, you can watch and see, oh, they're trying to trick me here. They're trying to slip this in. And look, I mean, since I wrote that 25 years ago, a lot more books have come out by Christians that are similar, and it's great. But mine is still doing well because I really kept it basic, and it's fundamental. And I think people can appreciate. It's kind of like art appreciation. If you want to learn, if you want to appreciate, classical music, you take a class and it teaches you the basics, dissonance, consonance, and whatever, all these harmony, whatever, different components and elements of music. And then you get to appreciate music more. So when you hear it, you can recognize the quality much better rather than just appreciating any ignorance, but you know more what's going on. But you can also you're able to spot things, just like if you took a class on learning about art history and you learn about the nature of painting, and then when you look at paintings, you'll be able to see what they're doing and have a more educated appreciation. That's what I did with Hollywood Worldviews, and it still works today. So anyway,
that's awesome.
I recommend your listeners check it out. If I do believe that people get it. People are a lot more media savvy for sure than they ever have been. Yeah. I still think my book's relevant, but in the day when I wrote it, I don't think there was as much of that recognition. It was growing in the church, and but there were still plenty of Christians who would say, TV and movies are just sex and violence. So they throw the baby out with the bathwater. Oh, it's all sex and violence, and they just wouldn't think through it. I don't think that's as big of a problem today, but I still think though that media is powerful, and we need to know how storytelling affects you, the viewer, because you don't want to be manipulated into seeing the world in a way that is ultimately false.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Let me ask you, and this isn't really a side trail, but it is something that comes to my mind quite a bit. I think that adults can be manipulated as easy as anyone when it comes to this, but let's make a broad assumption and assume that adults have to be responsible as adults. But when you get to children, younger folks coming up, watching movies, and I'm not going to sit and bang on anything in particular, but there's some really disturbing things that have been out over the past couple of years, Disney, certain movies and whatnot, that you're really getting into some occult things that are, blatant right there in your face. What do you have to say about that?
Well, that's a big topic for sure. Yeah, occult things, I guess there's always been, horror is not intrinsically evil, by the way. Horror is a way of showing the true spiritual evil nature of humanity in a way that can have a very strong moral moral context. In fact, horror is one of my favorite genres, and I've written lists. I've got my little list here. I'm trying to find it now, of movies of good examples of things that I find, and horror is one of them where, yeah, there could be some real bad occultic things, but there could also be some really good, powerful stories and meanings as well. So, for example, here we go. So, good example is Nefarious. That was a movie that just came out. As it happens, it was made by Christians, but it was a horror movie about a killer on death row who was demon possessed, right? And it was all kind of like a Screw Tape Letters, right? And that's a good example where they used it for good purposes, But there's a lot of other good ones, like well, I don't want to go down the rabbit trail, but you were talking about occultic and stuff like that, yeah. But in some ways, I think the bigger issue today is the sort of the leftist, I think just the leftist DEI problem that we have, where they feel like they have to have left-wing messages in their movies so blatantly and so strong that even you look at the Oscars now and the movies that they all. It used to be great movies like Lord of the Rings or whatever were nominated, but now they're all movies that nobody watches. Why? Because they're important movies that promote, their leftism, feminism, transgenderism, right? It's like they feel like those are the movies that should be awarded Oscars. But again, that's just preaching and pushing sermons, and they're usually not very good movies because they're preaching, And so yeah, that's just it's a common thing, and you're seeing more and more of it. I think a good example is the whole now if you look at action movies now, with DEI, it's like white males are, I could add more things like Christian and conservative, but white males are the privileged, this is their view. White males are the privileged people in society, and we live in a white supremacist society. So we have to have fewer white males in everything, including action movies. So you watch action movies and now they have to be led by a person of color or usually a woman. Like it seems like all the assassins are now women in movies, right?
Yeah.
And like in the past, like 15 years ago, it would be cool to occasionally have a woman who's an assassin as a unique, rare thing, right? Like, oh yeah, I guess that could exist. But now literally all the assassins are women. And apart from the guys like Tom Cruise and the guys that, you have to give them the leads in their movies. But like on Netflix and stuff, all the news things, women have to be the lead of everything, And look, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. I'm not saying that that's wrong, but when everything has to be that way, when you have to literally force women have to be the leads in everything over men, that's what DEI does. And then you get less quality. Because they're not good action heroes. Yeah. They're not. Men are better action heroes, period. And yeah, you can have an occasional one that might work, but like a Sigourney Weaver in Alien, right? But it's like, in general, no, it's not, because and people know this. And so people are watching less and less of the action movies because they're all led by women. Right. And, it's like, they're going to lose audience, and they're already losing millions and millions in audiences. So much so that, and then you get Tom Cruise, right? And and boom, Maverick comes in, and then they're like, oh well, those are the ones really making money. So eventually they're going to come back. I think if they really do care about money, they're going to come back to making movies that people want to see. But and Disney was the classic example of that, right? The Snow White thing was the latest thing where it's DEI. It's all of their political theories about, you can't have dwarf people, and then they got to turn the dwarfs into multicultural people with people of color and gays and transgenders and all this kind of stuff. And then they realized that it was tanking before the movie even came out. So then they reshot it. They put in animated characters, but it's still pandering to the sort of girl boss, women are better, women don't need men, all these kinds of things that don't fit with real traditional legendary romantic storytelling, and hey, go ahead and make your movies, but then more and more people are not going to watch them. And even Disney is, I don't know if they're waking up, but they're definitely recognizing that they've been making mistakes and they've been pulling back on some of that stuff, or at least they've tried to. But, like they failed with the Snow White thing because it was inherently created with this DEI mentality it was in everything. So you can't make a shallow change on the movie to get people to like it, by covering up some mistakes that you made. It's part of the genetic storytelling that with which they changed everything, right? And so yeah, it's happening everywhere, and all I can say is as a consequence, as a result, a lot of conservatives and a lot of us Christians, but also conservatives in Hollywood, have been pushed out.
Yeah.
They've hunted us down and won't work with us. And so now there's a parallel economy that's been going on, right? And, it's in the Christian realm, but also the conservative realm. The Daily Wire is making their own movies now as their own little studio. And you've got other little consortiums of filmmakers, conservative filmmakers outside of the Hollywood that are making their movies to their audiences, and they're going to sell well because we're appealing to the traditional sense of values, right?
There's an entire market that's been ignored. I mean,
absolutely. In fact, it's funny because the last movie that came out of mine was called My Son Hunter, and it was about Hunter Biden's laptop, and we wrote that in like 2020. I wrote that in 2020, and with the producers who sort of they came to me and they wanted to tell the story of Hunter Biden's laptop, but they wanted it to be entertaining and a movie, not a documentary. And so I thought, okay, well, let's do this as a dark comedy. And so we made that thing. But would you think anyone in Hollywood would want to be a part of that or want to release it, right? Well, some of the guys who starred in the movie, they're all outsiders. Like Gina Carano was already kicked out of Hollywood, so she showed up in our movie. Several other characters and actors. Who's the guy who plays Hunter in my movie? Oh, I'm sorry, I can't. Off the top of my head, I'm not thinking about it. But so people who were willing to make the movie already, their careers were in jeopardy. So they said, "What the heck? Let's do it." Nobody would distribute the movie, so they had to. Breitbart ended up taking the movie and distributed it online. You can only get it online at mysonhunter.com. And it's a dark comedy. It's rated R, so be aware. There's some, because after all, he did play with prostitutes and cocaine, but it was really more about the politics without being political, which is kind of interesting. There would be an example of a movie where you think, here's the preachiness, right? But we approach the story as, okay, this is Hunter Biden is a seriously flawed, dramatic character, right? I mean, he is very interesting. And he had this whole thing going on with his brother and his father, a relationship between those two sons and their father, that was a very interesting dysfunctional family dynamic. That's what drew us into the story. That's what drew me into the story. I wanted to explore that family dynamic in the context of this bigger picture of the politics and the world going on at the time. But it wasn't about, making all, showing how evil and politically bad they were. Like, Hollywood puts out these movies like the Dick Cheney movie, which one was that one called? I can't remember what that one was called, but in the movie about Trump and all this, whenever they put a political movie out, it's always, rabidly preachy and just unentertaining, right? And we didn't want to do that. And so we made it an entertaining, dark satire, but it was very honest with and sympathetic to some degree, obviously, with Hunter Biden. So much so that the left hated the movie because it was so truthful. But some of them admitted, wow, they kind of made Hunter sympathetic. Yeah. And they didn't understand that, because to them, if they were to make a political movie, of course they would demonize, like they demonized Trump or they demonized Cheney, right? And they didn't understand, why would conservatives do that? They actually thought maybe they didn't realize what they were doing. Like, you idiots. No, we know exactly what we're doing because we're artists. We know how to tell a story and be sympathetic to your character, even though they have major flaws. It's not hard. You don't have to be propaganda, and I was kind of proud of that fact, because, That's my goal. So I'm not afraid of doing explicit movies, but even then, I'm not interested in doing a documentary. I'm not interested in preaching a message. I want to find the entertaining component that is also universal about human nature. And that's what we did with Hunter Biden.
Brian, this is refreshing, so refreshing, because as you're going through this, I'm thinking about everything that I watch or consume, read, and so much of it is agenda based, propagandized
Yeah.
for whatever reason. Got to get my agenda point across. I got to preach this, whatever fact. And it's not just about religion or whatever. Like you said, there's all kinds of politics, obviously, the past however long has been major. But
Sure.
everything you're saying is just spot on. And I do believe, and I think you totally nailed it, that there is this entire group of people who feel left behind by the entertainment industry, Hollywood, maybe, that are ready to consume if you can just get the story out instead of the propaganda, without the propaganda. So,
And I think we're getting better at, but we still have ways to go. There are guys who are outside the system, but trying to work on the fringes of the system, like the latest movie, Reagan, the movie about Reagan. I highly recommend you all go see it.
Dennis Quaid, right?
Yeah, Dennis Quaid, man. Yeah. It's a great movie. My buddies made that movie. They produced it. And I know I've worked with them on other projects. And it's like, yeah, they're conservatives and stuff, but they wanted to make an entertaining movie. And they didn't want to just, make some propaganda piece, right? And so, yeah, it's occurring and it does happen. And look, frankly, there are even very good movies that come out of Hollywood. Sometimes I'm shocked, like lately, what was the latest one that I was just shocked of? There was a couple of movies. Oh, I mentioned about how DEI and just the leftism in Hollywood. Well, I was shocked that there were a couple of movies that came out that mocked and made fun of that very leftism. One was called Dreamscape with Nicolas Cage, and that was mocking the whole university system and its whole DEI sort of mentality. And then the other movie was American Fiction, which was a story of a black man who's forced by his publisher. He's an intellectual black man, but that's not acceptable to the publishers, the liberal white publishers. They forced him to write ghetto books, with cussing and language and stuff, because that's what black people like, right? And so it shows the leftist liberals are actually the bigots and the racists, forcing him to write that. And I'm like, this came out of Hollywood. I'm like, how did that happen? So it does, Hollywood still puts out some occasional good stuff. And sometimes they deal with these explicit themes, but they're able to turn it on its head and help us see it from a different perspective.
Amen. That's awesome, man. I really appreciate this. This has been awesome. Kind of a eye-opening, and it's right here all the time. But to have someone just explain it and talk about it in the way you have is very eye-opening. I do have one final question for you, and I just thought of this, and some of my friends, my golf buddies, would just be mad at me if I didn't ask someone like you this question. We often talk about this. There was a movie released many, many years ago called Tropic Thunder. I'm sure you've seen Tropic Thunder.
Yeah. Don't go full retard.
Oh, there's so many lines in that movie.
Oh, yeah.
But will a movie like that ever be made again?
Yeah, that's what people are saying. Like, certainly not now, right? But don't forget, there's always resurgences too, and there are pendulum swings. So, for example, comedy has been severely, hamstrung by the whole, this whole thing, this whole leftist mentality. But then some guys start to rise up, like Dave Chappelle, right? And Bob Burr and some other guys, and they say, screw it, I'm going to still say my jokes the way I want to say them, and I don't care if they don't see me. And then they get a gathering, and then those gatherings become very powerful and very influential. And then they, and that's been happening lately. Or you just work outside the system, and there's a whole world of parallel economy going on where you can get those kinds of movies made, but they're going to be outside the system. A lot of times in independent filmmaking, that kind of a thing. So no, I don't think that it'll swing all the way back to that, but it will swing a little bit back, I think, because at the end of the day, you know, even though many people in Hollywood are driven by their worldview, their agenda, political agenda, many people are also driven by money, and there's a lot of pressure. If you don't make money, you're not going to keep surviving. So, you know, we'll see. You know, I feel like also romantic comedies are ruined now. They're just no good romantic comedies anymore. Yeah. And I think it's this whole thing about men and women have to be so completely equal that there's no difference between them. Like, that's just crazy. And therefore, you don't have good romantic comedies anymore, you know?
Yeah.
So my wife and I we're going back and we're watching all from from 2000 up to 2010 or whatever. Sometimes even the 1990s romantic movies, like When Harry Met Sally or something like that, you know? We're watching the oldies because those are the only good romantic comedies now.
Yeah. I just, I laugh about what you just said. I can't imagine being in the dating scene.
Yeah.
Nowadays, it's crazy. But anyway, well, listen, I appreciate you coming on. Once again, your website for everyone. And then we're definitely in the description. We'll have your book about looking at movies and whatnot. So
sure. Hollywood Worldviews. Godawa.com is my website, my name, GODAWA.com. But I've also written several other books. If you're a Christian and you want to know more about this concept that we've been talking about, not just storytelling, but imagination and how does that interact with God, I've written a couple other books. One is called The Imagination of God. That's an easy one. And the other one is called God Against the Gods. And those are both books that talk about how the Bible uses imagination in a creative way for us to understand God and his word, not just our rational intellect.
Awesome, man. And of course, you want to make sure you get your latest book, which is out now, and the audiobook is soon to be out, Judah Maccabees.
Yep, Judah Maccabee parts 1 and 2.
Okay, excellent. I appreciate you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, maybe someday down the road, we'll have you on again because you're awesome. Thank you so much. The one and only Brian Godawa. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Man, what an episode. Every time Brian comes on, he just brings the fire. I mean, he's insightful, thought-provoking, and he is brutally honest about storytelling and media, something we need more of in this world. If you love this conversation, I highly recommend checking out some of our past guests. We've had the brilliant Doug Van Dorn on, Dr. Aaron Judkins, and best-selling author Mark Goodwin, all on the show, breaking down some mind-blowing topics. If you're new here, be sure to hit that subscribe button. We bring real conversations with real experts every week, cutting through the noise and diving deep into the stuff that actually matters. So drop a comment with your biggest takeaway from today's episode. And if you want to go even further in supporting the show, check out our YouTube memberships and Patreon for exclusive perks. Find out more at theryanfiles.com. You folks are awesome. Be amazing, be positive, and stay curious out there, my friends. And I'll see you right here next week on The Ryan Files.
Are you not curious?
Preparing to transfer the Ryan Files. Now.
I present to you, with great intrigue and wonder, the Ryan Files.